moment of March 14 was a defining moment. But it's also a moment when other masks fell off, and particularly the masks of the parties that were part of March 14.
All the consequences of what was not solved in March 2005 led to a huge disaster.
The reason why we're here economically is not only because of Hezbollah. And really putting all the blame on Hezbollah is, in my opinion, reductionist.
And it turns reform-minded people and perhaps reform-minded politicians into allies rather than opponents.
It's time to stop living in the shadow of March 14, 2005, and to really think of what can be a new opposition in the country.
You can focus all you want on other things, but you will still end up in the same place, paralyzed. Let me start this episode by thanking MTV for letting us re-record due to some technical difficulties, but for me, it's a privilege to speak to you, Diana, one more time. And I think it's actually more appropriate, by chance, to re-record today, because this episode is reflecting on two things at once. It's the wider story of reform, and it's the anniversary of March 14. So what better way than to record on March 14 and release this episode on March 14? So I want to re-engage you, Diana, on your role as the managing director of Kulluna Irada, as somebody who lives civil society, who breathes civil society, who defends civil society's role in Lebanon, and somebody that I've gotten to know the last few years as a tireless advocate of all things good: accountability, social justice, economic justice, and the word reform. Now, I know we're going to have a back and forth on what that word means to us, but with your permission, I want to go back in time. 18 years ago today, our generation was on the streets celebrating a unique moment, which is a majority of Lebanese seeing eye to eye for the first time since the civil war ended of the necessity to have the Syrian army exit Lebanon, a dismantlement of sub-state militia, and a shared cause for what reform meant back then. Hence, unique figures that represented the left in Lebanese politics, like Samir Asir and George Hawi, participated in March 14, 2005. I was going back in my notes and I noticed the Communist Party joined in on March 13, 2005, and then a day later, they're joining on the streets in wide celebratory chants of sovereignty and independence, liberty and freedom. 18 years later, look where we are. So I want to dissect this within an hour of what reform meant to you 18 years ago, whether or not you saw eye to eye with those protests back then, and we can pick up from there and, of course, talk about Kulluna Irada's role in the wider struggle for a better country. So I'll give you the microphone.
Thank you, Ronnie, for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking today. Indeed, I agree with most of what you said. The moment of March 14 was a defining moment. There's no doubt about that. It was a defining moment in the sense that, yes, Lebanese across different sects came together on that day saying no to Syrian hegemony. It was very interesting because after that moment, the division in the country was no longer along sectarian lines. It was really along a political posture, which is very interesting. Like, for the first time in the country, you felt that really the division is on politics. It's not on what sect that person belonged to. The second very interesting point is the sense of empowerment that people felt. The people who were on the streets, the people who created March 14, were the people on the streets, were stronger than the oppressor in a very unique moment in time, which is something that we didn't feel in in 2019 or that didn't materialize in 2019. And we'll maybe talk about that later. It was also a very interesting moment because masks fell off after this point. The biggest probably is Hezbollah's mask that at that point in time could no longer use the resistance rhetoric that showed its teeth and nails and turned after this moment to the local bickering and to the local politics, and basically turned into a killing machine after that.
It's a refreshingly honest retrospective from, I think, somebody, allow me to say this, who's more perhaps calculated at times with their words. I like hearing this from you.
But I'm going to continue.
Oh, okay.
But it's also a moment when other masks fell off, and particularly the masks of the parties that were part of March 14. And suddenly the rhetoric of independence and of justice, it actually became clear that this rhetoric was actually hiding the intention of power sharing, of a lot of deal making, and of a lot of corruption. And that's also, unfortunately, a mask that fell off after March 14.
You know, the way you're framing it is actually a nice entry point into exactly what reform means over time, because I appreciate the way you're outlining it is almost like that's the reason why Kulluna Irada exists, is that it's not just one issue, it's a multitude of issues that have gotten worse over time. Hence, a group that is trying to fix everything at once, and it's not an easy task. We're going to get into that. But let me go back in time again. I agree. I think it was harder to make your case for being a proud Lebanese patriot under Syrian hegemony, because when you did, you were usually exiled or killed. So I appreciate that a lot of the politicians that found their role post-Syria, many of them took the wrong decisions and decided to work with a new problem, which is the post-Syria Hezbollah's role. And Hezbollah obviously does not dictate all decisions. Hezbollah's primary focus tends to be security, which it has a built-in red line, and for the most part, Lebanon's foreign policy, when foreign policy is discussed. But I think it's primarily security, not letting the state function the way I think a lot of us imagined it would on March 14, 2005. So let's go from there. I think it would be easy to spend an hour talking about every mistake that was made the last 18 years. Rather, I'd like to pick your brain on something else. Would it be fair to say that reform, loosely termed, could not take place so long as that huge problem remained part of Lebanese politics? Because I'm of the opinion that every reformer that wanted to participate in that moment was sidelined once more. And the same problems that existed during Syria's occupation persisted. In other words, yes, the Syrian army left, but no, independence, the way we wanted it, or sovereignty, the way we understand it, did not happen. Therefore, reformers face the same problem. They could come from civil society. They could come, actually, I'll extend all the way. They could literally come from Hezbollah. There could be Hezbollah reform-minded members or supporters sidelined as well. The reform dies over time. Am I saying it in a way that relates to you, or perhaps you don't see it that way? You see reform as something else?
I mean, let's be clear. Sovereignty was a priority in 2005. This wasn't new. I mean, even historically, you always had this tension between forces that demanded sovereignty and others that demanded socioeconomic justice, equality, etc. And yes, in 2005, the forces that participated in the formation of March 14 prioritized sovereignty over other issues. And I think this is the positive aspect of October 2019. It's that for the first time, you had a reconciliation between both rhetorics. And you had people saying, listen, both these issues are priorities. You need sovereignty, you need to build a civic state, and you need socioeconomic justice. And these three components together are necessary, are interlinked. And I think this is where the October 2019 discourse becomes much more interesting than the 2005 discourse that focused only on sovereignty and that downplayed other factors that were equally as important in state building.
May I challenge you friendly in a respectful way that 14 years after March 2005 and then October 2019, I would think of it slightly differently in that all the consequences of what was not solved in March 2005 led to a huge disaster, which is the downward spiral turned paralysis, turned collapse, turned whatever, the free fall that we're now living through. And it happens to be today, hopefully it's the last number, but I don't think that's the case, 100,000 lira to the dollar.
Yeah.
Is there an argument to be made there that, yes, the chants were legitimate? Of course, October 2019 is as euphoric, as celebratory, as defining as March 14, 2005. Perhaps even bigger, perhaps even more all-encompassing, perhaps the biggest demonstration Lebanon has had in modern history. It may be the biggest one we will live to see, but that's a consequence rather than a reflection. It's almost like you wouldn't have needed October 2019 had March 2005 succeeded.
Okay. Let's be clear here. Hezbollah's role and presence has clearly been extremely negative, destructive on the economy, right?
On the economy.
I mean, you talked about the 100,000 Lebanese pounds. Of course, it's been negative on state building as a whole. But since you focused on the economic angle, I'm answering back along those lines. So, yes, Hezbollah's presence has been and role have been extremely destructive to the Lebanese economy, from the impact on tourism, from the bickering with the Gulf states, which were our main trade partners, from the illegal economy that was competing with the formal economy, and what so have you. This is very clear. Nobody can deny this. And from even turning the country into a narco state, right? But at the same time, the reason why we're here economically is not only because of Hezbollah. And really putting all the blame on Hezbollah is, in my opinion, reductionist. The reason why we don't have electricity today is not because you have an actor like Hezbollah. It's because Gibran Bassil, Nabih Berri, and Saad Hariri all wanted a share of the pie from the electricity sector. The reason why banks have not restructured until the moment is because all the political powers have something to lose. And therefore, the mafia-militia alliance is a truth. And it's a truth that's destroying us.
I will add one thing before we get into Kulluna Irada, which is really the backbone to this discussion. The three names you mentioned, and they're the obvious names that, in a way, took us to October 2019. Saad Hariri, Nabih Berri, and Gibran Bassil. I agree with the way you're describing that their role could have been less pandering and more corruption-minded and focused on that portfolio. I agree. At the same time, those are the three names that I think of that were the most. Hezbollah needs that kind of people or that kind of communal representation to survive. And it turns reform-minded people and perhaps reform-minded politicians into allies rather than opponents. And let me go all the way here. The one former militiaman that used to battle Hezbollah for years, Nabih Berri, the man fought Hezbollah on the streets of Beirut. He's been their ally for the better part of 3.5 decades. Gibran Bassil, his father-in-law, is the brand of reform, sovereignty, and independence for 15 years in Paris, and prior to that, in Baabda. That man becomes Hezbollah's very, very staunch ally up until the last few weeks. That could be only tentative. Saad Hariri, his father, we now know, thanks to the special tribunal, assassinated by that group. Saad Hariri is the preferred prime minister for Hezbollah and only returns to the scene after compromising relentlessly with Hezbollah. So the reason I'm putting it this way is, could anyone do better? Given that huge burden, these are not angels. Actually, you should be able to comfortably blame them for all their crimes when they're committed. But I can't see shining stars so long as 2005 is left unsolved. I only see that kind of group. What I also see, and this can factor in, is civil society trying to forge a new path, but also finding itself in the same problem. And that could be the entryway to Kulluna Irada. But the way I'm going back in time, the way I'm framing it, does that resonate with you? Since we're not far apart in age, and we both participated in both of these movements in different ways, am I being too assertive? Am I really putting too much emphasis on one thing? Or is there anything you could take from that and actually say, no, that is part of the story?
The shadow of Hezbollah as the elephant in the room is always present. The question of if somewhere or along the line, someone or a group were able to create a real balance of power against Hezbollah, like the one that was created previously, then how would Hezbollah react is a real question, right? And we know that all cards are on the table and all options are there. So yes, this is a real concern, not to be downplayed. But at the same time, there's something that should come before this, right? It's the creation of that new alternative and that new path that hasn't happened yet. And I think it's time to stop living in the shadow of March 14, 2005, and to really think of what can be a new opposition in the country. It's very clear that there's a new generation that wants something new, that is ready to go into something new that learns from March 14, 2005, and builds on it, but that is also substantially different, that is less sectarian, that is more grassroots, and really a different path. And this path has yet to be charted. It hasn't yet. Whether this path will ultimately create a balance of power that will be a real threat to Hezbollah to the extent that Hezbollah will react is another question. Let's start by creating that balance of power. We haven't done so yet today.
That's a great entry point into how Kulluna Irada is born and where it really comes from. We're both part of the You Stink era, meaning we saw fellow citizens that were politically minded take a back step from the national picture and go local. And that, I think, is really You Stink's legacy. It's going into municipalities, it's even running in municipal elections. And suddenly names emerge like Beirut Medinati, which was not part of March 14. There's no such thing on March 14. But in 2015, 16, that's a story in itself. Local politics. Kulluna Irada emerges afterwards. And by end of 2016, if I'm not mistaken, there's this reform-minded group that's trying to position itself as supporting anyone who's willing to do the right thing. Reform-minded politicians and reform in general. Do you think of Kulluna Irada as, in a way, its ethos is trying to do its best to focus in on the local? Meaning, I won't speak on your behalf here, but there is that tripod that's often referred to in Kulluna Irada. That yes, sovereignty is an issue, of course, sovereignty is a core issue. But economic justice is equally, it's also 1/3 of the pie. And then the third, this sort of, you have to tell me what the third one is.
The creation of a civic state.
The civil state may not be there yet, but that's a goal in mind. But that those first two are seen as one and the same. So I'll give you an example. Kulluna Irada is comfortable talking about the banking sector, and it's comfortable talking about Hezbollah. It doesn't shy away from either one, but it sees both as the same in terms of reform. And then maybe that's where you stink comes from. In other words, going local and emphasizing local as much as national.
I don't subscribe to this analogy.
Mm.
No, not really. So first, Kulluna Irada was born out of the principle that the Lebanese in Lebanon and in the diaspora wanted to create something for Lebanon and to break away from this division across the different axes, from the different international powers and from the regional powers that were actually bickering over Lebanon. They wanted to create a Lebanese option. A Lebanese option that is fully supported by the diaspora, fully funded by the diaspora, which is key, and focused on change in Lebanon. Now, of course, the organization was also flexible enough, as you should be in politics, to change across time, given the landscape. So while the organization started in end of 2016, 2017, 2018 as your typical advocacy group, where we'd go and convince local politicians to reform the energy sector in a certain way, the water sector, what so have you, it was clear by the end of 2018 that this approach has its limitations and that one had to be more aggressive and forceful in imposing change. And it was at the same time that the October 2019 events took place, and that was the point in time where Kulluna Irada decided to be fully behind the forces of change and the wider opposition. And this is where Kulluna Irada also was involved in the 2022 elections.
Yes, yeah.
And because the organization saw a lot of value in trying to create a level playing field between newcomers and political parties who were already established, who had their capacity, their campaigning capacity, their logistical capacity, and everything else that came with that, in order to try to level the playing field and to give and to support people who wanted to reach a wider audience. And this is what we did in 2022, and I believe the group's role in the elections was key. After that, and regardless of the evaluation of the different members of parliament that came from the change movement, but I think what the entire opposition was able to prove was that there is appetite for change and that there is a new force for change that is there, that is to be reckoned with, that has definitely to become more serious and more pragmatic, but that is there to stay and grow.
I got to know you in that stretch much better than before, and you were a fierce defender of the change in itself, meaning not shy to defend anyone standing up for the principles or the definition of what was October 17, at least to Kulluna Irada. And these list formations that took up a lot of people's times, but it was a meaningful exercise in seeing whether or not there is that kind of appetite, and clearly there was. Otherwise, there would not be 13 MPs born out of that movement now in Parliament. I shared the sentiment fully, and I think, yes, if there's a new generation emerging that wants to try something else and wants to maybe build on what was tried before and look at the failures of the past, all that is good. In the last 8 months, and this is present time now, they're not the same person, it's not the same chapter in history necessarily, but we have 2 MPs from that movement sleeping in Parliament. They've been there for 2.5 months, if not longer. It reminds me, but it's not the same thing, it reminds me of when Senora's cabinet was meeting between 2006 and 2008. In other words, people are trapped by a problem that's bigger than them. Now, I know they're not the same people. They don't see eye to eye in probably most things. You can't put Fuad Senora, Milhem Khalaf, and Najat Saliba on a table together. But that kind of shackled by things that they believe are true, which is, I'll refer to Najat Saliba here, the process, meaning the process is not working. I think of today's paralysis as the same as yesterday's paralysis. And I often think that that's maybe where civil society confronts the same wall as March 14 once did. And that's where my not that's where my bleak assessment gets bleaker, in that you can focus all you want on other things, but you will still end up in the same place, paralyzed. Neither Najat nor Milham, I think, can actually come up with a sentence referring to Hezbollah. I don't think they can talk about it.
Ronnie?
So that's, wait, hold on. That's a good thing. Let's see that they're trying to talk about everything else, particularly Najat Saliba. But they're hitting the same wall, the same damn wall.
And you're hitting the same damn wall every time you analyze everything, because you get back to the issue, because you get back no, because you get back to the issue.
Where's the wall right there?
Because
Yeah.
you get back to the issue of Hezbollah. We realize Hezbollah is the elephant in the room. But
Not
at the same time,
not Hezbollah. It's
But-
what 2005 could not do, which is end that chapter.
but
That's
Ronnie,
it. The state can work. The state can breathe.
But I think the reality is extremely different today. First of all, you have powers that have lost all of their credibility. I think if you measure Hezbollah post 2000, 2005 wasn't very far from 2000. You measure Hezbollah then and you measure Hezbollah today. I think it's very clear to a wide segment of the population that was previously maybe supportive of the group, especially after the year 2000, that was very supportive of the group then, that today Hezbollah is in a different place, that today Hezbollah prioritizes regional issues over local issues, and that Hezbollah is as corrupt as the rest and as unable to govern as the rest. Other political forces also have lost their credibility since then. And there is a need, and people today want to see a new force. The challenge today is that you don't have this force. You do not have a consistent, credible alternative based on clear political lines. And this is what should be created today. Yes, they're probably going to hit a wall, but let them create this first.
May I try to understand this better down the road? Are you suggesting that these 13 should be 65 change MPs for there to be progress? Is that the kind of, is it a numbers issue? Because to me, if you're going to go back to reform, there's 65 MPs today that are talking reform.
I'm saying
They're
that,
opposition and change MPs combined.
I'm saying first that these, not necessarily these 13. I don't want to be really stuck only on the 13 change MPs. I'm saying that out of this change movement, you should get a credible opposition. A coalition, a mega new political party, an assembly of the force, of political forces, but you should get a new political force out of the change movement, which is
Out of
which is
the
a
change
politi-
movement.
Out of the change movement, and I'll explain why. Because I believe truly that there is a segment of society and there's a huge part of the population that only the change movement can address today. And their role is to actually form a coherent, forceful, consistent force to talk to these people. Now, I also think that there's a huge need for these forces to collaborate very closely with the wider opposition. Because let's face it, you cannot create a balance of power on your own. So there is a need also for a wider opposition
So
that is also coordinated.
Kulluna Irada is going back to where it started, in other words, saying that the lines are not on change MPs only. The lines are now wider the way they were in 2017.
Kulluna Irada has always been pragmatic on that front. Even during the elections, we were always saying that the widest coalition of opposition forces possible would be, in our opinion, the most useful. Because, as I mentioned before, I think that there is a need to create a balance of power, and we believe that the balance of power can only be created through the widest coalition possible, provided that this is a coalition that is politically consistent and coherent.
I don't want to push too hard on this because it would be unfair to make it all about numbers, but I think it's safe to say that there are 65 MPs that could work together on what you're describing right now. There are 13 or whatever, 9 plus 3, 9 plus 4 change MPs, some independents now. And there are a sprinkle of other independents with bigger blocks that represent the opposition, and they come down to 65. That's a slim majority.
I think the political priorities of these forces and the political vision of these forces, I'm talking about most of these forces that you have mentioned, have yet to be clarified, solidified, in order for us to be able to judge whether you really have a coherent and consistent group or not.
So you're
I'm not diminishing.
yeah.
I'm not diminishing the importance of the common statements that were issued recently between 46 MPs at time, 48 at other times. This is, I think, a breakthrough. It's very important, but I'm just saying that's just a tiny start, and that they have a long way to go before we get to a real, solid, coordinated, and clear opposition.
So change and opposition, finding the broadest common cause possible, where you filter out the bad actors, and that over time you want that number to grow and maybe win down the road. So Kulluna Irada is really working for the long haul. There's no short-term victory in sight, because I think what you're saying, and I assume, it's that we've now established a change movement. We now have to see whether or not in 2026 that change movement can grow. But for the years to come, it's not going to be necessarily one of change growing or shrinking. It's going to be about trying to build bridges between opposition and change. And that's beyond Kulluna Irada's role. That's really politics in parliament. Am I getting that right?
Yes, what I'm trying to say basically is that there is a need for a more assertive change movement. It's very clear that there is no way out of this situation that we're living without a real change in the balance of power. What I'm also trying to say is, yes, there is a need for this solid change movement to create bridges with the opposition and to together form a forceful opposition. I realize that they may not meet on all battles, but at least on the battles where they can meet, coordination is definitely necessary.
Let's talk about coordination. It would be important to never exclude the port blast and its ramifications from this type of discussion. Even though that is where inertia finds itself in Lebanon, that it's easy to let go of tragedy and move on. But this one is just, I think you have to remind every single moment possible that you can't let this happen without consequence, which is why I celebrate Kulluna Irada's role. And not just its own policy memos or its own writings, working with Human Rights Watch, having very, very clear and concise messaging on the need for an international role and getting this thing over with. And maybe 2 weeks ago, if not less, there was a statement issued by the UNHRC, Human Rights Council. I always screw them up.
The UNHRC.
HCR is a different outfit altogether. HRC, yes. 38 countries or so, led by Australia, France's blessing, issuing a joint statement on the need for an investigation. But you tell me if I'm right or wrong here, that the emphasis is still on local, not international, but there's momentum for June, 3 months from now, for there to be a more assertive international statement made for that, meaning Tarek Bitar cannot be left alone. And I think there's a lot of emphasis now on June, on taking the statement issued and making it emphasize an international role. Yeah. Am I getting that right so far?
Yes. So basically, I mean, usually there are many routes to demand an international investigation. The Human Rights Council is one of these routes. This is a route that was initiated by human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, Legal Action Worldwide, and that was actually and this route was then developed together with the families of the victims and other organizations that were active, Kulluna Irada included, along the way. What the point to which we got today is that you have 38 countries that have said the Lebanese state is not taking this investigation seriously, this investigation is not progressing the way it should, and we demand that the Lebanese state push through on the local investigation. It's already good because it means that August 4 is under the radar of the Human Rights Council,
right,
that this is an issue that is being brought up and it's important for the states that signed it. It's also good because it signals that there was a clear change in the French positioning and that the French are now supportive of escalation at the international level, if we were to use that term. But this is short, this falls short of actually demanding an international investigation.
Right.
And therefore, the next milestone, the June milestone, should be a joint statement on behalf of these countries, and maybe more, demanding an international investigation. Because, let's face it, this is a track that should be pursued regardless of whether the local investigation leads somewhere or not. And here it's very important to clarify that. An international investigation does not mean that a local investigation is ruled out. These are two tracks that can run in parallel. And there are other tracks that could be explored, including the UN General Assembly, the UN Security Council, even the UN Secretary General himself. But today, the Human Rights Council route is the route that we're exploring until the end. Hopefully, in June, there will be a more forceful joint statement. Usually, what happens is that joint statements precede a resolution. So, this is common practice. So, hopefully, after a joint statement, the subsequent session would actually have an actual resolution demanding an international investigation.
I mean this from a sincere standpoint, not trying to put you in an uncomfortable corner. It's more to learn and more to hear it from your side. Because I think all the efforts are legitimate and you're standing on the right side of history. So I'm trying to better understand a group's approach here. This story of coordination, which is necessary, and trying to get international mobilization is not something new, meaning even when it's discredited by the usual suspects, even when it's sort of dismissed as a money drain, we had something like that in the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. But it's funny, when that name comes up, I think a lot of people just have queasiness in their stomachs. They don't want to talk about it. But at the end of the day, that was an international body, international investigation, international protection. Lebanese paid an ultimate price for it too. Intelligence officers working for it. That whole scene, a verdict issued, suspects identified, and the process worked. In other words, we had the answers provided. That those suspects are not in jail is the Lebanese state's burden, not The Hague. But that journey and having a clear majority in parliament that said yes to it, that signed on to it, that Security Council resolutions were declared on its behalf. And when there was uncertainty, whether it was between Senora and Birri or whoever, the Lebanese state, as it once was represented, was proactive.
Yes.
But I'll just finish that. It seemed like this was the state's last attempt at trying to assert itself and reaching a victory in that we had international attention, international action. May I ask two things here, and they're both touchy questions, but permit me. Why is that not the goal right now? In other words, getting a majority in parliament, demanding Security Council action, persuading and lobbying, if you can, Russia and China not to veto all the hard work that was done for the Special Tribunal to work. And the second question, which is slightly more sensitive, why is Kulluna Irada largely silent on the matter? Meaning, it's not really, it's not something that is brought up as a case point, as something that could be learned from.
You mean August 4th?
The Special Tribunal.
Oh, okay.
Even when it's not there's two words, I think, in Lebanese politics that are sort of put on the shelf. March 14 and the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. Yet, that's the accomplishment. That's the state working. Is there a shyness because it's too attached to Rafiq Hariri? Because if that's the case, it's 2004 to 2005. All attempted and successful assassinations. there's a document, political report. I think it's everything we dream of for the port blast.
I think the landscape is different today, Ronnie. In 2005, I mean, you had a majority in parliament that was able to request formally a special tribunal for Lebanon. You had a security apparatus that was able to protect whoever came to actually conduct an investigation in the country.
Yes.
Today, the landscape is different.
But there are change
And
MPs
today,
that we
the entry
supported
point-
that say no to international action.
I mean,
That's where I get confused.
I don't want to talk on behalf of the change MPs who are saying no. We know for a fact that you had actually last week a statement on behalf of 40 plus MPs demanding the international investigation.
Right.
So that's already a huge step. But the landscape is different. I don't think that today you can realistically expect a majority in parliament to demand this. Instead, but what you have today is an assembly of the families of the victims that is saying, I represent these victims and I want justice for these victims. And you have members of parliament who are behind them, international organizations who are behind them, and other change political parties and organizations who are behind them.
So the fact that the opposition and change are not more united in parliament, let's say, and just in terms of that issue alone, international action, and Tarek Bitar has more breathing space to do his job. Is it simply down to the fact that they cannot forge an alliance? And that's why a group like Kulluna Irada doesn't lean on the tribunal for a sort of, not a lessons learned, but more that this is something that happened in our lifetime.
Yeah, but I mean, you have the wider opposition that also issued a statement, and I'm not talking about last week's statement, but the statement on August 4, I'm guessing a month ago, I can't remember anymore. You have a common position across a wide block of the opposition, especially regarding August 4. I mean, yes, you have some MPs that have not signed it. That is their issue, but it's very clear.
But I guess why I'm focusing on them
Yeah.
is because they're the force that we're talking about. Yet they're saying the wrong thing, in my opinion. They're saying
Not all change MPs are the same. It's very clear. and
Yeah.
I mean, it goes without saying. But what is very clear is that you have a group of these change MPs, together with a wider opposition, that have taken very clear stances, be it on August 4, on the need for, on the local investigation, or on the international investigation.
I guess when I hear Human Rights Council versus Security Council and statements issued by Australia with France's blessing and then hoping June is more assertive versus a very proactive politics that demanded it, that's where I see the discrepancy. And I don't know if it's always fair to blame March 14 for failing, because to me that's how a group, whether it's March 14 or October 17, so many dates to remember, that any group that's trying to do that will fail, including October 17. Or the group that we're talking about, the new change opposition alliance that may happen later, that's sturdier and more robust in numbers, will do the same thing once more. I guess that's why I beat you said it's the elephant in the room. I'm beating the elephant over and over the same. It's because I want to live long enough to see some of these aspirations succeed. And I always learn from somebody like you that's telling me not everything is black and white. And there is still room for progress, and there's always ways to circumvent Hezbollah by trying to focus on things that are not directly related, and I agree. And that's why I lean on you to learn. But I fear, Diana, I fear we're living in a country that is destined to collapse rather than what Kulluna Irada wants.
I mean, looking at the way things are, yes, I mean, I wouldn't rule this option out, definitely. But I also strongly believe, I mean, this is not the first time that the country was in a very bleak situation, right? You have spent half of this episode talking about 2005. If in 2004 you had told me a year later the Syrian army would be out of the country, I would have probably thought that you were delusional. Other moments in time were the year 2000, definitely. So this is not the first time that the country is at a really bleak point in its history. Yes, the components of an opposition or of an active political force that is to reverse this reality are today very weak. But I think we are underestimating the change in people's minds and in their will to replace this political class. I go back to this number that I always mentioned. In 2022, the change movement got the second highest number of votes after Hezbollah. This is not a detail.
In terms of total votes.
Yes,
numbers,
250,000 votes.
Yeah.
This is not a detail. It
Yeah.
shows that people want change. Now, March 14th of March 2005 was a defining moment. 25 May 2000 was a defining moment. October 2019 was a defining moment. I think together, what we can do with these defining moments is have a common narrative that mutually recognizes the liberation paths of people in this country, and that today says we can create a common narrative and we can together today create a path that liberates us from the local oppression the same way we were liberated from the other oppressions that we survived.
You know, the more I speak to you, on camera and off camera, I realize we're talking about the same story, but it's almost like we're passengers in the same car and we're looking at different sides of the window. Maybe we have different rear view cars behind us. I think we share that common rear view mirror, but the way you just framed it, it's impressive because you're right. All of these are important dates and they're landmarks. Some of them are achievements in that people demanded change en masse. But the moment you said 2005, my mind went to May 2008. And that's how March 14 died. And you said October 17, 2019, my mind went to October 2021, when Tarek Bitar's rule was paralyzed. And we were on the brink of street violence and anarchy. The threat of violence in Lebanese politics, the ability to pervert politics through weapons that we don't have and we don't want. We don't want them and we're not looking for them. But the fact is, our goals are very commonsensical. They're real, they're legitimate, they're honest, they're decent. I still put the burden on that story. And
Ronnie,
I
let me
think
ask you a
there's
question.
no way to
Let me ask
turn
you a
around.
question.
Yes.
Do you think the threat of violence today is higher than the threat of violence in 2004? Do you think what today do you think that what today the forces that are controlling this country are capable of doing is more than what the Syrian forces were capable of doing in 2004 or what the Israelis were capable of doing before it? You always had hegemonic forces. You always had odds that are not to your side. But at the very end, I think all these moments have proven that people are stronger than the oppressor. People are stronger than the oppressor. And I want to also reiterate that all of these moments belong to the people and not to the political parties that try to claim that they created them.
I'm going to give you the last word. I'll just open the door to trying to answer, and the way you framed it, it resonates with me. There's certain tools that you cannot use today the way the Syrian army and intelligence once used, meaning no one can shut down MTV today. It's not going to happen. We're talking about these issues in MTV.
They can stop it from airing in Dahi.
Maybe, but even then, there's ways to watch it.
Of course.
But let's say that's as far as you can go. And even then, it's useless. That type of censorship doesn't work here. But MTV is not shutting down. And we're talking about everything today. We couldn't do that before, hence the station shut down for 8 years or so. That's true. We can talk today. The threat of violence for talking, I don't think it's real. We can talk we can say whatever we want. But I fear, Diana, I fear anyone that takes real risks and trying to reform in a serious way the state so that this web is untangled will meet the same fate many Lebanese met. Tarek Bitar is one of those more courageous modern day judges who took risks. didn't get far, but he took risks and he showed us. It's almost like symbolically saying, this is where my limits are. This is as far as I can go. Anyone that tries to do more would meet the same fate as those before. I think that is where, once violence has decimated leadership and has demoralized society and has made us older than we are, Diana, we're not in our prime, although we should be. We're tired, we're exhausted.
I still have energy.
You have a lot of caffeine and maybe a few other things that you've ingested. I have just an espresso. I want to wrap it up with your words. I've said a lot. I want to hear you. You have the floor. Say anything for where you see things moving down the road. And maybe we won't need to celebrate or remember or look back on March 14 every single year, but I think we can build from it later. And I'll open by saying Ziad Majid, somebody we both know, you mentioned he tweeted this earlier today, and I'm glad you mentioned this before we started recording, that he's handing the torch to the next generation. Maybe he's speaking to you. Maybe he's speaking to people younger than you. So I'll let you end this episode on your terms.
I know that things are bleak, but I also know that there's a huge force of change that requires more organization, more political clarity, but that is there. I hope that in a few years, we will be celebrating a new milestone, that we won't be only looking back at March 14 or at October 17 and saying we wish that had happened or we wish that had gone another way. I really believe that we can do this. I know that there's a huge risk on the people who are attempting today to create a new balance of power. I know what we are up against. But in the end, when an entire population stands up and says this is what we want, it cannot be stopped. It simply cannot be stopped. And we have tried and tested this and succeeded previously. And I'm confident we'll succeed again.
I know that civil society is more dynamic with someone like you involved. Lebanese politics is healthier so long as you remain in this country. And Kulluna Irada could not have a better managing director than you.
Thank you.
So thank you, Diana.
Thank you, Ronnie.